The Vietnam War was still in its early years. The war of attrition had escalated on both sides. The North Vietnamese Army was emboldened by victories earlier that year and were working with guerrilla fighters of the dreaded Vietcong to move south and infiltrate U.S. and South Vietnamese strongholds. It was the night of December 23rd, and U.S. Allied forces in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or the ARVN, were stationed at the Trahn Yend outpost on the Mekong River Delta. The troops sensed a stealth attack from the Vietcong was imminent, but were powerless to stop it. The local guerrilla army was closing in. ARVN officials had radioed a nearby U.S. Air Force base requesting aerial assistance. The situation was beyond tense. The guerrillas were accustomed to this procedure and knew they had to simply retreat back into the jungles and fields and hide and wait for the planes to exhaust their munitions. Eventually, the U.S. planes would assume the enemy had either been wiped out or withdrawn and would themselves retreat from the area. The guerrillas would then re-emerge from the shadows and re-engage their attack. For the Vietcong, though, that night was different. Huge streaks of bright red unleashed from the sky like glowing, thrashing tongues. They rained down in heavy electric blankets in all directions. A new and powerful weapon had introduced itself that night, the Douglas AC-47. The glowing red of its ammunition gave the craft a nickname that quickly spread among the ARVN, the Dragon Ship. The Dragon Ship. Surprisingly, the massive fury of red ammunition that had so successfully dampened the Vietcong that night was nothing more than a modified World War II-era cargo plane. It was the innovation that went into its modifications and streamlined the process for wartime production that proved to be the key to the AC-47's enduring success. In use since 1941, U.S. Air Force engineers reasoned that the C-47 could be reimagined as a close air support solution to provide quick and heavy artillery backup to Allied forces on the ground. In this sense, the AC-47 became the first of its kind, a side-firing, ground-control gunship of the future. The pilot could easily toggle to fire all three miniguns at once or control them independently. This allowed for greater offensive flexibility in the air. The gunship. Lateral-firing gunships were not a new concept, but they had been resisted for many years. It took a military insider and an engineer from Bell Aerosystems to finally achieve the vision required for the gunship to help him achieve his vision. The military man was First Lieutenant Gilmore C. MacDonald, and the engineer was Ralph Flexman. MacDonald had long espoused the idea of a side-firing ground support aircraft, and Flexman immediately knew he could do it. In April of 1963, MacDonald and Flexman brought on Air Force Captain John C. Simons to aid with their endeavor. After some quibbles within the Air Force, the project finally met a receptive audience. Project Tail Chaser. The Air Force approved Project Tail Chaser, albeit unofficially, and overseen by Captain Simons. It then took Captain Ron Terry, a fighter pilot who had already seen action in Vietnam himself, to come aboard and give the project real impetus. Terry used his experience in the field to address a specific area of need. He noted that only U.S. flare ships, such as C-123s and C-47s, which circled overhead and dropped illuminated flares, aided in warding off stealth attacks. Terry and Simons worked together with the limited equipment on loan to Project Tail Chaser. They modified a twin-engine C-131 trainer and discovered that by maneuvering the plane in steady, rounded turns, they could keep the side-mounted guns fixed on a ground target with relative ease. Terry got them approval for live fire tests at Eglin Air Force Base. However, since the program was not officially funded by the Air Force, he had to put in the expenses for additional hardware on his own credit card. Ensuing tests both at Eglin in Florida and at target ranges in the Gulf of Mexico were immensely successful and turned analysts and observers into converts. They were then given a C-47 Skytrain as the next test aircraft. The C-47 proved to be the perfect model for Simons and Terry's modifications. They were durable, slow-maneuvering planes, meaning they could hover over a small area for long periods of time. Its history as a cargo plane meant there was plenty of express space to carry additional ammunitions and flares. Additionally, every fifth round fired was loaded with a distinctive red tracer round, a glowing bullet that, when the craft's 3 guns were firing at high speed, created the effect of a bright red rain. It was an exceptional innovation, a special kind of flare that helped illuminate the enemy while also blanketing them in heavy fire. The Dragon flies. Terry and his team, now operating under the title of Project Gunship, arrived at Tan Son Nhut Base in South Vietnam on December 2, 1964. They brought with them the plans and necessary equipment to modify 2 C-47s. However, the crew immediately faced unexpected opposition from the Air Force brass stationed at the base, who told them they were not to unpack or speak to anyone, and that they, along with their equipment and plans, would be dispatched back to the U.S. immediately. Apparently, a 4-star general had filed an official complaint after seeing Terry's plans to modify C-47s already on the ground in Vietnam. The reason? The general believed the project didn't fit with the Air Force's prevailing operational philosophy. However, Vice Chief of Staff John P. McConnell intervened before Terry and his team were booted out of Vietnam, telling the general that, quote, "We cannot overlook or deny any weapon which will enhance our capability in this area of operation." The first modified C-47 test craft was ready by December 11th, the second by December 15th. They were dubbed the AC-47, AC for Attack Cargo designation, and given the radio call sign Puff, short for Puff the Magic Dragon. The appearance of one of those AC-47s at Trahn Yend on that night of December 23rd represented the first significant victory for the gunship in a combat situation. The AC-47 was a huge success. All of its combat engagements in the final weeks of December 1964 were successful, so much so that an urgent request for a full squadron of AC-47s was made by the Air Force. The Air Force request cited the plane's immense psychological importance to ground troops when compared with other aircraft strike efforts to date. Spooky success. By November of 1965, 20 AC-47s had been manufactured and shipped to Vietnam. An AC squadron was created, operating with the 4th Air Commando Squadron and deployed to Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base. The planes were then given another official call sign by Air Force pilots, Spooky, likely due to its intimidating, spectral presence and its appearances primarily at night. By the end of 1965, Spooky gunships had been used in 277 combat missions, fired 137,136 rounds, and helped keep American forces engaged on the ground at a time when the war was turning in the North Vietnamese's favor. Their operations then expanded into Thailand and Laos. In 1966, the squadron moved their active headquarters to Nha Trang Air Force Base, further to the north, where a second group of AC-47s, the 3rd Air Commando Squadron, was also established. Both squadrons were redesignated as Special Operations Squadrons in August 1968 and continued to be used to extraordinary success in night-based defense missions. Captain Terry, always the innovator, had already moved on to designing the next iteration of the Spooky gunship by this time. Having observed the movements of the Vietcong in Laos and North Vietnam on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Terry had concluded that the Air Force would need an even more advanced modified gunship. This one would need night vision equipment, armor, and super navigation to infiltrate the complex geography of North Vietnam. The Ghost Plane. In all, 53 total aircraft were converted into AC-47s, 41 of them successfully making it to Vietnam and serving in the war. America may have eventually lost the war, but records show that no village, hamlet, or outpost that was protected by a Spooky squadron was ever lost to the North Vietnamese Army or the Vietcong. As the conflict in Vietnam drew to a close, the remaining AC-47s were transferred to the air forces of the Republic of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The AC-47 still sees some use worldwide to this day, as in when Colombia started retrofitting AC-47s for their own air force in 2006. They're used in the South American country's mountainous jungle terrain against insurgent groups. The AC-47s have created their own mythology in Colombia and are known to civilians by an equally spooky name. The Colombians have dubbed it the Avión Fantasma, or Ghost Plane.